So one thing that's been an underneath that I know of would be because I know the background to the coal mining stuff, and I've written some stuff on this anyway, is the unfinished stuff about the involvement that women had in the strike, and the involvement that they had after, the way that arguably was sometimes appropriated or ran into organisational blind alleys toward after the strike, when, as I remember, the women were making a case for membership at the NUM, and that, well, yeah, they smiled, Jean, and that hit a kind of a last bastion of patriarchy, if you like, in that setting. So, what I'd like to bring that sensibility that you're exploring in shift work to reflect on what we tried to do when we came here, and maybe what we've tried to do as a project, and I'll have to fill you in about some of that stuff because you may not know. But if I can, if you just let me be indulged, if I can just read a bit to remind you what you said, because I think it's spot on. So it's called Shift Work, this collection. The theme of shift work derives from our identities as four women living and working in the post-industrial environment of East Durham. Much of our writing and visual art seems to coalesce around our complicated and sometimes ambiguous feelings for this locality. Shift work reflects this, operating at different levels in the broadest interpretation of the meaning of shift and work. Thus it moves beyond the immediately obvious definition of the time patterns of paid work in mines, shipyards, factories, transport, health services, and more recently call centres. It refers also to the unprecedented shifts in the industrial environment and culture that we've experienced in our own lives. The historical shifts have had consequences for our understanding of the nature of work, social life and family, which includes a heightened awareness of shifts in social relations, including major shifts in gender relations. And then you also talk about the connotation of the word shift in terms of clothing, as a shift, as a woman's piece of clothing. Dealing with clothing, making, buying, washing, mending, dressing, undressing and fashion has been central to our work as women and emerges time and again in our writing. Yet female work with clothes is frequently invisible, hidden and not perceived as work. We want to challenge that perception, which I think is a kind of fabulous statement that also that speaks to ambiguities and complexities that we're keen to tease out of the work that we've been doing. So if we sat and watched all the Ghost Labs, Max has listened to everything because he's just today finished producing the radio documentary, which is the next bit that we're going to try and circulate across these international song lines that we've talked about when we designed this project. And I'll come back to that as an explanation of what we're trying to do. But I would imagine that if we looked at the levels of contributions, we looked at the gender spreads, and so on, gender is very present in this project. The women at Sunderland, the song that Brenda's written about that is effectively a recognition and celebration of their independent power as women.
She says the specific thing of, I talked to Brenda and Jeff on Skype and interviewed them and found out kind of their thoughts at each Ghost Lab. And in the Sunderland one, Brenda recognised, she said that these women are more of the world than I could ever be. So it was, and it's, I guess it's that kind of, it's not just knowing, it's not just feeling. It's something that combines all of that and is a great power.
Yeah.
That she recognised, that I think was evident, wasn't it?
A way of being in the world, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So really, what I want to do in this session is open up this session to explore that space. So that's why it's particularly appropriate and gratifying that I'm talking to you too. and to think how that particular sensibility, or positionality, if you want to call it that, can find its place in this work that we're trying to do, so that we don't have to. Okay. So I've just kind of given you some background to what we're up to, but it's probably worth me saying something about the project in its overall context, because I can't remember how much you will have actually picked up, or how much I actually said about the overall project and what we're doing when I came up here.
I mean, I certainly have had a good overview, but have you?
If I had to put it in a nutshell, it's why we are today because of what we grew up through. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah, that's a fine summary of it, in the sense that so there's a book behind this work, and it's a piece of work that we're particularly keen to acknowledge how much what we're trying to do is really something quite simple. We wouldn't claim that we did that work, and I won't claim that as an academic. So there's a piece of work by an American academic called Avery Gordon, who wrote a book called Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, which I bumped into, and because I was doing work in the coalfields at the time, it suddenly made enormous sense. Because I've been doing work in the coalfields, I've been growing up in the coalfields from pit families for generations and all the rest of it. In the period around about 2000, when some of the villages down there were still in a really, really dire state, and it was very clear that the strike had not gone away. It was 15 years before, it had not gone away, there was still conflict around that, and it was also clear that the impact of the industry in very real terms, such as ongoing injuries that had been caused, pneumoconiosis and all the rest of it, it had not gone away. And I'd been trying to think about that, and when I picked up this book, this idea that not only might we be haunted individually, we all know what that might mean, we have a sense of that, but she was basically saying we can be haunted collectively, right? And it suddenly made a lot of sense to me. So that is the book, that's this kind of theoretical theory basis for the work that we've been doing. So we're trying to operationalise that and think, right, well, if there is such a thing as a collective haunting, how do we work with it? How might we find out what the ghosts are trying to say and do whatever it is that they seem to be telling us to do? So that's what we tried to do.
I mean, does it in some way assume a contemporary collectivity? Because one of the difficult I don't know what it is, it's a discontinuity for me, because it's something about the collectivity of the past, which was based around the whole mining thing. And then what we have now is not the collectivity, so it seems to raise a problem for the idea of a collective social haunting. So I'm not saying there's not some sort of thread that maybe holds some people together, but I mean certainly in terms of this town and the new population.
On Monday, Jean and I attended a meeting for a heritage lottery grant thing, and we found ourselves trying to be visitors in our own town. They brought us to Church Street, the main shopping precinct just here. Walking down Church Street, having to have a look at what needed fixing.
As if we didn't know.
And then, for me it was really odd, walking past the local sort of greasy spoon coffee shop and wave at my sister and her husband in there. And the folks in the cafe are looking out at us, suits, plastic tabs, thinking, who's that, what are they doing? Walk further down the street, bump into my brother, who's going across the street and says, what are you doing? And it was really odd, kind of like being of the place, but then being asked to look at the place So there's this duality that's always going on, isn't there? Yeah, it's very, so it is collective in that, yes, they're my brother and my sister, we brought up in the same house, same family, blah, blah, blah. But I'm not of that family still. I've been able to move on, change. So, yes, it's collective and that we share the same experiences growing up, but what we did with those experiences has been really different.
I mean, I think that's like a really pertinent point, and already we're getting exactly where we want to be in terms of this discussion, because I'd have to say, I don't know, maybe it does assume a collectivity in that sense, and maybe there's a theoretical flaw in it. What we're doing is experimenting. It's not like, you know, I've written the book and we're coming out here and the book's the gospel kind of thing. Because clearly and that experience, I mean, I have that experience every time and I've kind of not left. I still live in the same village, but everybody knows that I've left. So, you know, if somebody needs a reference for something or somebody needs something in writing, they come round to Jeff.
Is it like me, like you're the one who went away?
Yeah.
I was the first one who went away. You're the kind of, I like to think I'm the white sheep of the family, you know? Well, it's the first one to go off to university.
And also, but because I was also involved in the strike and stuff, I'm kind of like, there's one community within the other community. So the collective, if you like, is complex. It's almost like nested kind of collectives, you know, like the little Russian dolls. So right at the heart of it still is a small and dying group of men who went through the strike and were active in the strike from day one to the end and went all over and went all through that and were arrested and imprisoned and so on. And then there's outer nests around the women who were active, who were also starting to die as well, certainly where we are. There's one or two gone. Right out to this whole post-coal mining community is sat in the midst of what is just now a suburb of Sheffield that's got a suburban kind of new house, new car type area. It's, you know, there'll be something around here that looks exactly the same as it. So the idea that there may be some transmission occur over history and time obviously begs a lot of questions, like what is community? Is there one community? Is there 10 communities? So they're pertinent questions. I don't know, but what I think we do know is that I could walk out in Seaham now. I know people who I can tell. I can see it in people's comportment, the ways of being pretty well. Generally, if they mean that they've got a coal mining background, I could start talking to somebody. We've done it, we've experimented, I've almost experimented. Start talking about an academic project, then use this idea of social haunting, and they'll say, I know exactly what you mean. I understand that, mate. So there's something about that idea that speaks, and I think that's interesting. Even if the whole notion is a bit clunky and a bit got all sorts of potential theoretical or confusions underneath it.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to point out a particular theoretical flaw. I was just sort of thinking about community and what exists as community and whether there still is a community. And if you were talking about social haunting, are we just talking about like those people who belong to that past and who've been part of that past who are still, I don't know, what are they still part of? Is the question, I suppose the question it's raising for me is, what are they still part of? And then how far can you integrate other people? We've got lots of incomers. I mean, this has been a town of incomers at the beginning of the 19th century. That's a 19th century new town, so everybody joined together, created something based on a commonality, which is what community is in the end. And then now we've got a new thing happening, and new people coming in, and you know, you hear all sorts of.
My new neighbours questioned, said, "Oh, did Seaham used to be a mining town then?" We've moved on
Exactly.
that
So,
far, yeah.
so we've got something different now, and then what we've got is we've got a solid core of people who were here in the past, but then lots of people moved out. I mean, in the 1960s, like we are of the generation that was moving out, and there was a population decline, and there were people who moved out in the main didn't sort of come back really.
But isn't there a thing about also, if there are absences, the fact that someone has to say, even though this place was so centrally tied to its industry, that someone could possibly say, in all, you know, without any knowledge, like, is it that was there a coal mine here? Is that absence is haunting in a sense, that it doesn't matter that new communities are constructed on top of that old or original or whatever community, that if people are experiencing questions that are slightly troubling as to why there isn't something there, or why there is something there where it shouldn't be, that can instigate questions of like, you know, how solid are our notions of time, and compartmentalising time and periodising things. So like a sense in which the past is with us and troubling in some way might speak across, you know, and we've had ghost labs in with like Pakistani women in Rochdale who originally would have come through to the textile industry, and now they spoke of their kids leaving to find work, like leaving to find work, whereas they were brought to find work. You know what I mean? So there's these processes and these layers of community that interact across time.
I suppose the question I'm asking is whether there is something that can be clearly defined as community anymore in this place, and it's like that Sigmund Berman thing, like once you stop being self-conscious about community, do you actually have community? Do you know, because community is something that you do rather than that you think about, except that you can do it when you think about it by performing, which is to a certain degree what those of us who have come back having been away can do, so that you can be in the cafe with your sister and be there and be one of it and complete, or you can be outside and looking at it and objectifying it at the same time. So I mean, this is all that stuff about ambiguity that we're going on about in there, because you inhabit, and what you learn to do is play to roles. I mean, I tried to say something about that when I was talking about my relationship to the strike or to the Vane Tempest Vigil, because I could be one of us in terms of the local people, but that being one of us in terms of local people demanded certain ways of being and certain ways of behaving. Or I could be one of us in terms of the people who were coming from outside and be a lefty feminist, and that demanded a different sort of set of ways of being. And so the trick is to do both and to find a way of transcending it, but going into another space altogether, in order to be able to exist in a way that's actually creatively useful. Yes.
When I'm out of Seaham, people say, "Oh, you're from the northeast." But when I'm at home, people say, "You're not from around here." And it's that even something as basic as how you speak, you're a bit of a sort of chameleon, aren't you? You wear different things according to the circumstance in order to survive.
Yeah. I mean, even in here, I can be 2 or 3 different things almost all at the same time, depending on who's coming in.
So is that, I mean, I'm really curious about that. It's fantastic because it just speaks straight to me about things that occur for me. Is there also particularly a woman's layer to that as well?
It's gendered. It's
gendered.
Yeah.
It's gendered.
Yes, and I mean, if you were to go back to if you would go back to the campaign, the event Emma's Vigil, and I remember you met Merton was here on Saturday, and I remember one day Merton sort of stood at me and she sort of looked at me and she said, "The thing about you is you're one of us, aren't you?" And I thought, yes, but I've heard that before when I've been in London amongst a group of Jewish Marxists.
Right.
Somebody said, "The thing about you is you're one of us, aren't you? Like, you can't escape from being one of us." But you can't escape, because that is what you are, and you can't escape from it. But it's only a bit.
But you've got a whole orchestra of what you are and you can be.
Yes.
And growing up here made us like that.
Yeah, because you have to behave in particular ways anyway. I mean, if you're a woman growing up in Seaham Harbour, in the time when we grew up, then you have to be one thing in a public space and another thing in a private space. And I don't know, do you ever read Sheila Rowbottom talking about subterfuge? And one of the most important books for me ever, apart from The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, was Women's Consciousness, Man's World. And what was important in that book, mainly, was that she talked about women's subterfuge. And I started thinking, do you know, all our lives are subterfuge. The whole thing, everything is like, it's like a very simple example is my dad giving my mother his wages, and that's what she's got to live on. And he's terrified of debt and all that sort of thing, so my dad's wages aren't enough, really. So my mother pretends to my dad that his wages are enough, and then she goes to my dad's sister, and then she gets out a privy check with his sister, who's also keeping the secret from her husband, who will see my dad, and so there's a whole like women's network of debt going on, which is intended to maintain the male mirage that whatever it is that they're doing is keeping the family, but actually they're not really. And I mean, that's just one example, because there's a whole lot of other things which are about performing.
Just exactly the same. Christmas time, not enough money to go around. My mum and I and brothers and sisters go to Sunderland, go to Joplin's big department store, and take a club out, get the Christmas goodies in, coming home on the bus, sitting, peeling the Joplin's labels off the tins so that my dad didn't know where we'd been. So he imagined or whatever that everything's hunky-dory and there's plenty of everything.
Yeah. So there's all this stuff, and it goes a bit deeper than just, because the money is symptomatic of it, but there is something about the way in which women will kowtow to the idea of male power. So the men have got the power and they've got the control, and ultimately they have, because there's a male violence ultimately, which is where all power is. But actually, on an everyday level, there's a whole element of behaving in particular ways where the women are taking power unto themselves as a collective, and it's hard to find the words, isn't it? But it's like there's a knowing. So there's a knowingness between women when they talk to each other about what they do in relation to men, and there's a knowingness between women about what you have to do to survive, which is a sort of empowering thing, you know. It's and it gives you a sense that you've got an element of control, and you know what the boundaries of that control are. But actually, the men think that they've got control over that, and they don't. So their power isn't as great as what they think it is, even though ultimately, I guess.
But in the end, they had the physical power.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So in the end, but you know that. So you learn all these ways. It's a survival technique for women in the first instance. And if you were to stay here, and if you would have stayed in that life, that's what it would have been, wouldn't it? It would have been a survival, and you would have continued to play that survival to a you know, more or less, depending on your own situation. Then if you escape, which is what it was.
You see that there are other ways of being.
You see that, but you can also use those skills, can't you, to be, I don't know what it is. It's subterfuge is the best word that I could, you know, the academic word might be performance, I don't know, it's like, it's the best word that I can find. There is a sort of subterfuge going on, and there is a sort of acting out. So you learn to identify the roles, you get a very fine finely grained consciousness about the nature of social relations and the nature of social power, which I think lots of oppressed groups get. I don't think it's just women, but people in particular oppressed situations learn to read situations, and then that allows you, or it enables you to develop certain skills in acting out certain roles. Yeah, in real situations, it's a self-protective thing. Yeah, that's not too glib, is it?
No, I think that's right.
I was just going to ask about how coming back. You know, if we're thinking in the absence of the industry and the way that affected like society in community in Seaham. You know, coming back. Did you both come back after? Did you come back in time, as it were, for the pit closure? Is that the kind of timing?
No, I only came back 12 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So it was all gone.
And I mean, how did your the kind of crystallisation of your politics and your feminist politics, kind of how did that meet coming back? What was how did you feel coming back and talking to people who'd not left around about women's power?
I came back to the North East in 79. I came back to Sunderland in 79. I remember feeling that I had come back into a different position from the position that I had left. So it was like I inhabited a different social space, and I was sort of invisible here. We got a joke. I don't know, I might have said this to you. We got a joke about my brother saying, you know, Alan Spence, has he got a sister? You know, and that sort of sums it up. Like I didn't really have a place in this society in Seaham Harbour. When I lived living in Sunderland and being a youth worker, and then there was a whole community of people who were incomers who I could relate to in a particular way, but also I could do the work because I understood the working class life and again it was this thing about being able to perform. I was a much better youth worker in Southwick than I was in Enfield, right? Because just because you know what's going on, you're culturally aware, aren't you? You're culturally aware of everything. And then coming back to Seaham, I always had family, so there were always links and there were always people where I could locate myself in the town. So that was 1983. But then I couldn't do the strike. I couldn't do the strike at all because I couldn't relate to the local Labour Party because of the way in which it was organised and the masculine dominance and everything and the masculine culture. I couldn't relate to the way in which the women were behaving because that was about going into the kitchen and cooking, and I just spent half my life trying to get away from it and what that implied. I couldn't do that. I could have done the women's role. I didn't want to do the woman role that would have taken me into that space at that time. It was too difficult. It was too difficult trying to marry all the bits together, and everything was so intense, and the idea, the way in which everything was pushed forward, that like working class women weren't feminists, these were minors. I mean, that was something else altogether. That I haven't really explored that, I think, and that might be a ghost for me. That my natural inclination would be to be involved. I had all sorts of practical problems around time, but my natural inclination was to be involved, but psychologically and organisationally, there was no way to do it. There was no way to do it because the contradictions and the lack of a foundation for getting in, and then what I knew about the NUM, what I knew about the men, what I knew about the way in which the mining politics were organised, and everything was just. It was just what I'd been fighting for years and years and years. So really complicated stuff, very, very complicated stuff, which I don't know if it'll ever be resolved, really.
What about you coming back, Jack?
Mine's a much more sort of a smaller personal, I think, rather than a political statement. I left when I was 17 to go off to art college. I had to leave Seaham. Father left home when I was, about 12, moved in with the woman next door, My littlest brother used to say to me when my dad was coming home and going next door, why is my dad going in there? Coal allowance suddenly shifted to the house next door with a coal, with all kinds of sort of male sort of physical violence going on. I just wanted to be out. But looking back, it was about, for me, growing up was like trying to get him, the big wage earner, to love me. You know, he was at work, or he was at the pub, or he was in bed, or blah blah blah. So I think I mentioned before that school was gave me sort of validity or relevance, if you like. So I went off and got an education. Met a fella, moved in, and the first week I moved in, he was living with his mum. She said to me, "Oh, I'll show you how to iron his shirts." So I spent 25 years still kind of feeling that that's what I had to do. Although I, went, I've got a degree, taught, head of department, blah blah blah, but still coming home to that 1975 frame of mind where I did the cooking, we were both at work, but I did the washing and I will iron the shirts. And then came and left that marriage, came back to see him 12 years ago, threw the iron away. I'm never ever going to iron anything ever again, especially not a man's shirt.
See, I never mind. I never ironed a man's shirt after I left home in 1970.
And what was the feeling about like going through that process and like rejecting that? How did that feel in Seaham, even though obviously that was later than?
We're probably still unusual, aren't we? As women who don't iron men's shirts.
Don't iron anything. Ever.
It's I think my sister would be horrified. Just send them a line, just shake them at the right time.
Smooth them down and put them on the radiator.
But it became a sort of metaphor. That's my painting on the front of shift work there, the white shirt with the branding iron where the heart is. Yeah, it's really liberating not to iron.
When we talked about it, I mentioned Tilly Olsen. One of Tilly Olsen's key stories, you might remember, Jean, is I Stand Here Ironing.
Yes.
Tilly Olsen's wonderful.
I think I've still got the book in there.
So there's a whole set of gendered social practices and social beingness, if you like, and community beingness that's gendered, that seems to be a rich future potential seam, if you like, that's underneath the surface of what, even when we try and do the ghost labs, which are meant to be a place to get under the surface, we find that when we get to we just scrape away the topsoil of new communities, and we hit of communities that are now no longer coal mining, and we hit something underneath that's about the strike, right? That comes through very quickly. Or it did when we did all the stuff in South Yorkshire. The people that were attracted to the ghost labs were a new generation of activists mainly, who tended to, I think this is a fair summary, this may be a bit clunky, but who tended to articulate their own contemporary activism using the strike and its militancy or its imagined character to define their own activism, as if it kind of gave them legitimacy. And that tended to stay very much at a masculinized, heroic notion of what the strike was about, and finds its way into some behaviour that really unsettles me, and it's always unsettled me, such as chanting at every Sheffield Wednesday match when they play Nottingham Forest, scab, 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 and all the rest of it. And it stays at the level of some of the aspects of the strike that for me, and I wrote about it at the time, that when I was close to them felt far less about grand questions of community and social justice. This seemed very clearly related to football terrace masculinities that I'd also been part of and had known quite well. So I wasn't imagining it. I know what the terraces were like in the 70s. And then underneath, so when we think about what do we take from all that experience, what ghosts do we hold with us as we imagine futures in these communities, the women's stuff, which is probably, and again I've said this for a long time to myself, the richest seam of the lot that came out of the strike is still a long way down, and now it's captive to a kind of trade union socialist remembrance of the strike, which is very flat and very flat.
There's a sort of acceptable narrative now, isn't
Yeah,
there?
there's an acceptable narrative. The women kind of have like they're a little motif on the end of it, which is, oh yeah, and didn't the women do well kind of thing. But the real challenge, as I saw that in the strike, which was the challenge of a way of being differently to often what was happening at some of the demos and stuff that I was on, that's not been registered, not been, maybe because of the subterfuge that's generic to that gendering, that maybe that subterfuge is still keeping the old fella happy kind of thing, in terms of, well, now we remember it as there were no scabs in Yorkshire, there were no scabs in South Yorkshire, that all started as soon as you went across the Yorkshire border, and wasn't it simple, lads? If we'd have just all stuck out, it would have all been all right. And then what the women brought to it all the time was complexity. Complexity, it seems to me, just biographically, complexity, emotional complexity, political complexity, tactical and practical complexity of how to do things differently, that haunts the memory of the strike, and therefore haunts how it might land if we let it land and finally start to deal with it within the communities as we reimagine what they might be. Which is a long way around, I'm sorry I talk like I talk, it's a long way around to saying that it seems to me that the model, the world that was modelled through that gendered prism, primarily by the women, is one that we absolutely must carry right, must be right at the forefront of the reimagination of what these communities might be, rather than just becoming communities that are emptied out incomer communities that kind of have a bit of a flat history and it fades away, because I still think there's a lot to be learned from the sociality that was invented, particularly by the women during that strike.
But the women,
yeah.
I mean, the women have always worked from their real lives, just like the men do. So that like the combination in unions and the NUM is inevitably a masculine union. But the women's activism, and you might have read some of this stuff that I was trying to think through with Carol Stevenson.
And that's terrific stuff.
The women's activism is broader than that, because the women's commonalities aren't necessarily just to do with workplace. They might include workplace things, but then trade unionism is only one aspect of the commonality that the women the women have together, and the primary mode in which women have done things hasn't necessarily been defined as political activism, even though it might be community-based activism, but that's because of the nature, that's because of the way in which politics has been defined and what politics is and what politics isn't. And one of the things that feminism did, and I don't know if it did that for you, but like the personal is political again, it's like, was like magic for me. It was magic to my ears. The personal is political. Okay, right, okay. That means that doesn't just mean that like my personal life, but it's like the doings in a sphere outside of trade unionism or what normally counts as politics suddenly become alive, really, in different ways. I mean, it means that you can self-consciously work them, or you can strategically think them through, or whatever. I mean, my interest has always been in how can you make the world better?
Yeah.
How can you make the world better? Full stop. That's it. And women are always trying to do that anyway, because they're always trying to. I mean, not every woman. To be a bit daft to say it was every woman, but generally there's this sort of
negotiators, aren't
yeah,
they?
yeah. They're trying to work things through to better the lives of their families mainly. That's where it starts, isn't it? And their children, and that's their primary mode of being, and they do that through interconnections that they have at a sort of community level, as well as at work. And then if you can think of that self-consciously as politics, then you can do things with that. And I think the strike is just like one piece within that, so it's not necessarily the major thing. I mean, for me, what's really important politically is something which is basically educative, and something about how can people learn to change, and how can people be empowered to change, and what sort of organisational process is the right sort of organisational process to do that, and how do you work that out strategically. But I don't know if that's gendered.
Leaving a school where the boys went for their careers interviews and were asked which one then, what would you like to do, which pit are you going to? But from in the same era when my mother said to my sister and I, you don't need to pass any exams, you're going to get married. So for me it wasn't about the strike, it was about getting out of a place where it didn't matter what women did, stay at home. I didn't want to stay at home and do the washing, ironing, cooking, whatever. I wanted a life outside. So yes, it was political, but with a small p. Does that make it? It's personal, but it's still political, I suppose.
And you want to create the opportunities for other people to have that life beyond those sorts of restricted ways of being, because like it's easy to romanticise all that and to say how marvellous it was that we were all a community. It was bloody hell, it was a pain in the arse, you know what I mean? You couldn't go out there.
It's about being cold, it's about being hungry.
No, but you didn't have any freedom.
No.
I mean,
No,
there was
I mean,
absolutely no.
yeah.
I mean, in the place where I lived, in a little cul-de-sac, there was no freedom. I mean, there were assumptions about what you were as a woman. There were assumptions about what you would become as a woman, just as there were about being a man. But it was different for being a woman. And then if you tried to exercise any sort of freedom or any sort of autonomy, there was always somebody watching you. Always, you couldn't go out of the house without somebody knew where you were going. You couldn't have a secret meeting with a boyfriend without somebody would see you from the top of a bus. Everything would be reported back, always. And like the restrictions were just awful. And if you had any way, I mean, I remember saying to my mother once, and I said, my mother was not a stupid woman. She really was not a stupid woman. And I can remember looking at her and saying, but Mum, do you never think about things? Do you ever think about anything? And she sort of looked at me like blank. She said, when I was your age, I used to think about the choir boys. What? And I was trying to get her. I was actually trying to get my mother to think about where she was, or to talk to me about something which was other than what I was going to have for my dinner or the rest of it. She didn't dare. My mother didn't dare think outside certain parameters, because if she had, then that would have meant dissatisfaction, that would have meant turmoil, that would have meant she would have had to get out. She couldn't afford it, it wasn't possible.
So it's one of the things about, I mean, because we've been thinking about the Ghost Lab as a quite a precious space in terms of like allowing people to speak, and I'm wondering if like, it sounds like your mother and other women didn't have a space in which if you open that door, where's it going to lead? Psychologically as well as practically about income and things like that. But I mean, thinking about a space in society in which, in all sorts of ways, in which we can't speak or can't imagine difference enough, there isn't the space for that.
I'd like to think it was different now, but God, in 1974 when I came downstairs and I didn't recognise my mother's face, because her jaw was broken and her eyes were black and because of what he'd done, but she was at home with 4 kids. I was the eldest, I was 13 or whatever, and I think at the time domestic violence was judged by the police as you don't go, it's a domestic issue, and there was nowhere for her to go. And looking back, I used to think, why did she make us stay there? Why did we have to put up with that? There was nowhere to go.
Either went back to your mother, or you went back to your mother and father, which was like the pits, or they would say, you made your bed, you lie on it, it's your choice. And then that was it. And I mean, I didn't have that experience. My father didn't drink at all. That wasn't part of the drinking mining culture, because he'd experienced that in his family, and so there were limits to his anger was limited by the fact that he didn't drink, so he was very angry about
I think I'm
everything.
still frightened of alcohol. I don't drink, and I get very anxious around people who are drinking.
So there's a whole lot of stuff there which we probably haven't even begun to explore about that industrial period and that coal mining and that the alcohol. I mean, the alcohol in this town when I was a teenager. The lads who I went around with, and the way they drank, and they would come out of the pit and they would tip into the pub, and like the girls had to go along with it, like wherever it was that the boys were collecting, that's where the girls had to go to be with them, and they would drink until they fell over. I mean, it was nothing, absolutely nothing to drink 10 pints in a night. And then so there's like the Friday night out, the Saturday night out, and then the Sunday morning was the men's time to go together to the club to watch the stripper, to drink more. So they'd be drunk when they were out already on the Sunday night with you, and you think like this is a whole overwhelming cultural part of we've got a dry throat when we come out of the pit, and then.
No, I absolutely recognise that.
Who wants to live with that?
So I guess for me, as a boy, growing up very close to my mother, who had some particular disturbing experiences, and for good or ill, shared them with me when I was really quite young. The promise of violence if you don't kind of fit in, if you get outside what is permissible, and it's always a male voice that's saying, don't leave, go down that road kind of thing, because you'll get it, basically. So that sense of violence always about to happen, which around my dad was a drinker, he'd been in the war, he'd been a prisoner of war and all the rest of it, he'd had it rough, but he was a drinker, and there was always you were watching him. If he'd had enough, you'd kind of keep your eye on him, and my mother was all subterfuge around him, and very able in that, but what had happened to her just inoculated me against any romanticism about the communities. She was a little anecdote, because it speaks to the nature of the communities. She married a lad at the beginning of the war, pitman up the street. It was just up the street there, about 40 yards away where we lived. Pit gates, right there, present, making its racket and the horn blowing and all the rest of it, and the trembling of the ground and stuff. Married this lad, he joined the Navy, went out to the Far East on his first voyage, was sunk and killed. And as my mum said to me, well, I went off the rails. She was working on war service on the railways, a time that she She never worked again after that. She kind of looked back to this time. But anyway, she went off the rails, as she said, and she had a child to another chap, an affair soon after this. And they drove her out of the village. The women drove her out of the village with the rough music stuff, the dustbins and all the rest of it. And she had nowhere to have this child apart from a sister who she had to get to her sister to have the child. And the child was